Have you heard of the sandwich generation? Some people think this is just those of us that are Gen X, but actually what it's referring to is that middle-aged section of adults that are squeezed between raising kids and taking care of aging parents. And more than likely, about 70% of those folks are also working. So three major caretaking things that they're doing all at one time. And if this is you're not alone. 16 million Americans are right now currently sandwiched between those two generations. And I'm going to tell us a little bit about some statistics around that because I'm starting to see more and more of my female clients trying to figure out how to balance all of this. And I have this impression that a lot of them are throwing gasoline on the fire rather than actually helping themselves through this really difficult time. So if this is you, or if this is somebody you know, or if this could be you in the near future, then you'll want to keep listening. Welcome. You're listening to The Centered Midlife, a podcast that teaches women in midlife to unapologetically stop silencing their dreams and start designing the lives they want to live in. I'm your host, Dr. Natalie, and as a clinical psychologist of the last 2 decades and a twice-divorced single mother myself, I not only know how hard it can feel heading into midlife, I am living it right here with you. I have taken all the many failed attempts and lessons learned in my own life and combine it with my extensive clinical experience to give you the tools you need to make midlife the best time in your life. No joke. So let's get started. Welcome back, everybody, to The Centered Midlife. And what we're going to talk about today likely affects many of you out there. In fact, it's probably one of the only midlife experiences I haven't had yet and will unlikely have at any level that most of my friends that I'm seeing in this group and most of the women that I help are having in this group. Because both my parents passed away when I was in my early 30s, actually 30, 31. Both of them passed away about 9 months apart. So being sandwiched between kids you're raising and parents that you're caretaking is not something that I have been up against, but it is definitely something that I'm seeing all of us be up against at this point in our lives. So I thought that it would be really a good idea for us to dissect it a little bit, talk about it from an emotional health standpoint, and talk about like, what are my thoughts? Dr. Natalie, what are your thoughts on how you can handle this and handle it better? Because I definitely see this phenomena where we're using some old patterns, the kinds of survival mode patterns that we learned earlier in our adulthood when we were all drugged up on estrogen and progesterone and all of our girl gang that come with her. And now we can't really hold down the fort this way, especially when we're adding that extra caretaking duty of caretaking parents as they're aging. So let's go through some statistics, shall we? Nearly half of all adults aged 40 to 59 are in this role in some capacity. And that's all adults, not just women. But the average caregiver right now is 51 years old, and 60% of those 51-year-old caregivers are women, so more than men. Not to mention the fact that even though there's 60%. I mean, that's still 60-40. It's better than some of the splits that we've had in cultural genderized norms. Women do tend to spend about 45 more minutes a day in this caretaking capacity than their male counterparts. So it's 60% of us, and we tend to be doing more in those roles. And as I said at the beginning of the podcast, they say 69%, so nearly 70% of us are also working full-time jobs when we're doing this sandwiched caretaking between our children. And we're talking about children that are aged 18 under. I'm not even getting into the fact, and the stats go much higher when you start talking about your young adult children, because you and I both know that our young adult adult children are not fully functioning out there on their own. The world is on fire, and it's really hard for our 20-somes to go out there and completely independently function. So they still depend on us quite a bit. And we're still maybe having some separation anxiety. I don't know what to call it, but still having some difficulty transitioning from transactional parenting to relational parenting, which is the natural progression that naturally occurs as your kids age. And that is transaction is I do for you, or I show you how to do. You're very dependent on the transactions I take to function in the world as my child, right? Well, once they're 18, 19, 20, 21, that becomes less and less. And it shifts, our parenting shifts into this idea of relational parenting, wanting to be their biggest fan, wanting to support them, but not doing for them. And this can be really difficult on women more than men, I think, because of our codependent acculturation. Let's get, I've talked about this many times on this podcast, but let's get rid of any kind of discomfort that my child might have. I will just do for them. I can already anticipate they're going to be making this mistake and this mistake. Lots and lots of problem solving, lots of advice giving, and lots of dismissiveness on the parts of our young adult children, right? So I'll leave that for an episode later, but that is not the sandwich I'm talking about. The sandwich I'm talking about is adult parents aging and needing more care from us as we're in our middle age, full-time working, and we are caring for a younger generation. Now, you may have been somebody that never had children, and believe me, you're in these statistics too. So please don't think that just learning how to caretake your parents alone is something that doesn't create an emotional toll on you. Of course it does. So here's the cost, though, that no one is talking about. 64% report moderate to high emotional stress. Duh, you're doing 3 big time jobs, right? Kids, parents, and a job. 45% report moderate to high physical strain. So it's not just emotional, but it's actually hard on our bodies. About 50 of our bodies are taking that toll. 24% feel completely alone in it. I know I've heard that phrase many, many a time from the women that I've worked with and even friends of mine. And 88% say they need more support, but few are asking for it. So remember how at the beginning of the podcast, I said, I think you're pouring a little gasoline on things? Well, the not at 88% not asking for help when help is needed. They need more. They feel alone, and yet they're not reaching out. This is one of the most debilitating old patterns that women get themselves into. I think for so long, we just didn't want to take up space. It's almost like we have a fear response. Like we're panicked about taking up space in our life and needing any help, not showing that we can do it all. And because of that, we double down during a time when we really should be reaching out, right? We're adding caretaking our parents during a really difficult season of their lives and season of our lives, to be honest. We're asking ourselves to just add that like it's a to-do list item. Well, my friends, it's much, much more than a to-do list item. And as I've said many times before, there's only so much room on your plate. So you are either going to decide what's on that plate and take things off that plate, or the plate will break and decide for you. And the physical strain on the body, almost at a 50% level, that's a plate breaking, right? The emotional strain, that's a plate breaking. And I don't want you to be stuck in that same position. So let's talk through what are some ways to get out of these bad habits that we've been in for so long. Before we get there, though, I also want to talk about the fact that there is a real financial squeeze in this too, which adds a different element to it. These are, adults that are full-time working, but sandwich caregivers are twice as likely to report financial difficulty compared to those that are not caring for their elderly parents. And the weight of this comes from all sorts of direction. It's time, it's money, it's body, it's emotions, right? But the financial squeeze definitely is its own element in this. So the reason I call this, I think that you're pouring gasoline on a fire, is that it's that double down principle. I do see that when women get stuck in the sandwich generation and they're caretaking in several directions in their life, one of the aspects of what they get into is this overwork principle. Like, I don't think I've ever met a woman that hasn't met a task she can't figure out, right? Like, I used to make a joke that if ever I was stuck in an elevator, I would want to be stuck in an elevator with a young mother, because the purse of a young mother could probably let at least 5 adults survive for several hours, if not days. Let's be honest, right? It's probably got meds in there, it's got snacks in there. There's like all sorts of stuff in a young mother's purse. And most women that I know kind of keep that problem solving mentality all through their life. In fact, I think it starts really young. I think that as we're reared and we acculturate the gender norms of girls and boys, the boys get choice more often than the girls. The girls get expectations more often than the boys. And that isn't a rule across the world. There are certainly subsects of our acculturation in that, but I want you to think about this, that girls are from a very young age acculturated to caretake. And part of that is to have expectations around the house, expectations with siblings, expectations out in the world, like with their schooling and their sports and things of that nature. Boys are asked to enjoy and make choice around what are the activities you want to be in. Do you want to hang out with friends? Do you not? The expectations around, are you going to do the laundry this week? Have you done your chores? Are not as high as they tend to be with girls. Now, this has been changing generation after generation, thank God, but it definitely was the set point for anybody in that sandwich generation. So we're talking about adults in that age range that I talked about at the top of the podcast. And they grew up in the 70s and 80s, right? They grew up in a time frame where those gender roles were pretty rigid and pretty solid, and they were seeing boys get choice and girls get expectations. And so that principle has kind of just insidiously been present throughout our life. And we have this overwork principle, this idea of, I've never met a problem I can't fix. I never need, I never can even sit on my laurels, because if I've solved all the problems in front of me, then I need to over anticipate what's the next problem that's probably coming down the pike. And I should get ahead of that before it ever comes my way, right? So there's this idea that you shouldn't rest. And rest probably means laziness, probably means that you're in some way not earning your keep, not, showing your worth, not enough in the world. That overwork principle, when you're adding a caretaking responsibility, that is a huge life shift, like caretaking parents. I mean, the roles are shifting. You're telling them what to do. They're not telling you what to do. You're moving from relational. Remember how I talked at the top of the podcast that with our young adults, we're trying to move from transactional to relational. Well, now with our parents, we're trying to move from relational to transactional. I have to make decisions about your finances. I need to make decisions about whether or not you can live independently or how independently you can live. I have to make decisions and work around so that I can caretake your health needs and get you to the appointments that you need to be at. This is such a shift and such a time commit, right? That it impacts us. It impacts us in our emotions and in our physicalness and in our finances. If I got to take time off work, that's less time I can take off for myself, right? And if I'm taking time away from things at work, I might feel guilty and not take time off just to take time off, like I had told all of you to do in my last episode on this podcast. So these are the ways in which it kind of insidiously starts to work in. But this overwork principle that we all seem to have bought just completely. We drank that Kool-Aid, and we truly believe we will just keep solving those problems and keep adding items to our to-do list. And we have kind of this everlasting capacity for it, has now met up with the time in our physical life as women that we actually don't. We don't have that kind of stress resilience. We're going to run out. We're a finite resource and we're going to run out. So that takes an impact on our physical bodies, on our emotional stance, and on our finances. And we really need to, again, going back to that plate metaphor, decide which of the things are coming off my plate if mom and dad are coming on it, right? Which of the things I have to let go of? So the next piece that I start to talk to the folks that I work with about in this is that programming and conditioning we're really hitting up against this here. So I want you to think about this. There is this idea that you are somehow a bad person. A bad person if you say no to taking care of your parents. Like, I just don't have the capacity for it. It's one too many things, and there are items on my plate that I actually can't say no to, like dependent children under the age of 18, or a job that financially is supporting me and my family at this point. We feel like we're bad if we say no. We do. There is very, very strong programming and conditioning that this should just be something that we suck it up and do it anyway, right? There are relational issues that have not been resolved in family systems. And there is programming and conditioning around you owe it to them, even though these relational issues have happened. So there are some very narcissistic or on that spectrum type of parents. The Gen X, between, ages of 35 and 65 even, boomer parents, parents in those earlier generations had a different approach to parenting that had a much more, you owe me kind of programming and conditioning behind it. We've evolved since then. Our present day ideas of relating to our kids and taking care and nurturing them and attaching to them, very much different than it was back then. But we joke about, these parents let you out in the summer, lock the door, and told you to come back when the streetlights came on. And yet that was the parenting style. And some of the relational behaviors and habits, patterns, they have not resolved since you were a kid. So there are definitely parents that have high expectation that you owe things to them. You've tried to feed that throughout your adulthood. You've tried to set boundaries as you realize that that was impacting you. And you may have even succeeded in setting some of those boundaries. Maybe you came and talked to a therapist like myself, and we helped you to navigate that, because many times it does take kind of a moderator of sorts, a third party with an objective perspective to help you through that. But now you're up against, do I get a choice here if I want to caretake this person? My boundary has been, I'm limited in how much contact I have with them. I kind of keep it in a box or keep it in a container that I can handle. So it's like holidays and weddings and anniversaries and funerals and things of that nature. And I don't take personally, the undercuts that my dad says or my mom says. But now you're going to have to caretake them and have a lot of interaction with them. And they may not be the healthiest people for you to be around and exposed to that much. Do you have a choice? Do you get to say no to this? Programming and conditioning of our culture would say, you are somehow a bad person if you do that. So there is a lot of people that feel obligated and stuck and add this to their plate and go back to their old overworking principles. I'll figure this out too. I'll just lump it in and add it in. But you truly aren't prepared for this. Now, I can't make this decision for you or not. I can tell you, and you can believe me or not believe me, you're not bad. You're not bad. And if you need to set that limit, you can set that limit. And if you feel like it's not in alignment with who you are as a person to set that limit, even though you probably should, like if it was any other relationship, you could have a hard no, but not with your parents. And I encourage you to talk to somebody like myself, because I definitely think that navigating the trickiness and stickiness of that definitely needs some extra assistance at this time. What I will say is that you will want to incorporate some form of self-care and make sure that you have the resources available to you to handle and take on this extra amount in your life, right? You do not have the capacity to pull in that much without making some major changes in your life. And so I definitely think that's a piece of this, is what resources do I need? So if the boundary can't be that I'm not going to have this much exposure to my parents. Now I will, because I'm caretaking them or becoming a major part of their life and life decision making from this point until the end of their lives. Then I need the resources to have a place to go away to, take care of myself, rejuvenate, renew, rest, and cut, stop with them, not have that be there. So if, you're doing an extra 45 minutes a day than your spouse, this might be one of those places. The resources, if we don't split it 50-50, I can't do it. Right. And if we're doing it for my parents, we're likely to do it for your parents. So please, let's talk about how do we do this? If you have a partner, that's a good place to get started on where are your resources. But self-care and resources are definitely a main part of intersection with that programming and conditioning piece. In general, though, you have to pull it out of being connected to your worthiness, right? When you say no to something, it has to be okay with you. And you need to be aware for a long time that bumped up against, am I a good person? You have to tell yourself, I'm a good person and I'm saying no. So any places where you have to put up some limits in this, putting up those limits and boundaries, you have to divorce that from this idea that that somehow means your worth is less, that you're not enough, that you're not keeping up with enough. Again, I think that talking to somebody like myself is really helpful during a time like that, because you do really need that sounding board that's helping you to keep that completely separate. This is not a function of whether you have the moral capacity to do this. This is relevant to, do you have the physical resources, the emotional resources, or the financial resources to keep up with this? You can be a good person and not be able to do it because those resources aren't in place. Sometimes I think that, when we're in this sandwich generation, it might be kind of a blessing. In a weird way. It's a place in our life where there's a rub, and we are going to have to reorganize around it. And instead of thinking to yourself, like, I haven't felt like myself lately, I'm not being able to keep up with this stuff, I want you to think about adding to that. And this must mean that I'm growing. Like, reframing it for yourself is part of how you create that distance between you and hustling for your worth in these choices of how to caretake and whether to caretake and when to caretake when you're in that sandwich generation. We just spend way too much time in our life on this idea of looking good on the outside. And that is the other bit of gas that we're throwing on this fire, right? How we appear on the outside is another element of the programming and conditioning in our culture in America that's huge. So I want to appear as if I'm this giving and selfless person is part of how we develop things in our life. So I believe that midlife then becomes a chance to step out of that cycle. And it's exceedingly important when you're as depleted as you are and have as much on your plate as you do if you're in that sandwich generation. But this is a place for us to be the ones that are the cycle breakers, right? So our real transformation is going to happen on our insides, not our outsides. It's not what we show other people and that we appear good. It's that we feel good and we want to live with ourselves. Because ultimately, we're the one we're living with the rest of our life, right? It doesn't matter if my neighbor thinks I was selfless, if my parent thought that I did what I owed them, if the culture thinks that I'm, being a good sandwich generation person and taking care of my kids and my parents at the same time. It doesn't matter, really. In the end, the person that matters is the person you are and are living with every day, which is yourself. So my whole podcast is all about the inside out, generating that idea of self-worth and creating that relationship with us, with ourselves before we go out into the world, all because I know that that's where this really makes sense. That's where we really will get the most bang for our buck. So on your plate, I think that oftentimes we have fallen off. We are one of the things that has fallen off that plate, or got a little chip and we fell off. Definitely we should be at the center of all of that. And when we are, and we're doing that inside work, and we're coming back to the, set point of, how do I feel about this? How am I doing with this? Is someone taking care of me? Am I taking care of me with this? Then you are much more likely to have the resources that you need to get through this time in your life. But just because I know that all of us like to feel like we are serving, right? We want to have a little selfless action in this. One of my courses when I was doing group coaching was selfish is the new selfless. So I wanted you to see that self-care really is a form of serving others. I want you to spin taking care of yourself and doing that work from the inside out as something that is a selfless act. Think of it this way. You are parenting while, if you're in sandwich generations, you're parenting while you're taking care. What are you showing your kids when you are putting gasoline on this anxious fire of, can I keep up with all this, and just add something but aren't taking care of yourself? What are you modeling? Is that what you want to model? Do you want to be in your 70s, 80s, and 90s and your kids start doing that for you? Or will it tear you up that they're seeing like that they're like depleting themselves trying to keep up with what your needs are? Will that make you feel awful and guilty? When you think about this, that the model that you really want to leave them with is that they get to have choice. Your parents didn't give you that. They had programming and conditioning that says you owe this to me, but you want to be a different generation. You want to cycle break and tell them not to. Your words really are a small percentage of what they're going to learn with that. Your actions, huge. So if you really want to leave the next generation in a better position to feel like they can take the things off their plate they need to and put you on their plate if they want to caretake you when you're in your older generation, but do it in a way that they're resourced and they feel worthy and they feel like they have choice and can say no and set boundaries where they can't do, then you really need to show up that way now, right? And you need to model that now. So your taking time for yourself is a way of modeling that for them. You investing in the inside out work of, I have to make sure that I'm cared for first, and then I'm a better version of me. And I said in my last episode, there's this funky kind of math that when you invest in yourself, you all of a sudden have more energy to go put out in the world anyway. You may end up being able to do all those things on your plate if you started and centered around taking care of yourself first. And now you're cycle breaking and you're leaving a model so that your kids can do this differently and not struggle with, the mind gymnastics and the heavy, am I good enough kind of thoughts about, if I choose to say no and put them in a home, does that make me a bad person? If I say, I'll do this and this, but I can't do that and that, am I a bad person? These are awful things that a lot of women in this category of the sandwich generation are struggling with. And, if anything, sometimes if I can anchor them to, what are you modeling for these kids of yours that you care about so deeply that they're not going to be one of the things that fall off your plate? How are you actually helping them when you don't help you first? When you don't set limits to what you can do? When you don't say, I will only say yes when I have resources to say yes to, right? I think that is one of the ways that you can kind of cheat the system for yourself. I know that everybody likes a good gold star and that they did something right. And so I would just encourage you to reframe it in that way and see that taking care of you and doing the work for yourself is actually the work of caretaking the other people. If that 45 extra minutes that you're caretaking was actually taken for you, I guarantee more will be able to be done because you'll be more resourced and rested. So just distill it down to making your life better, loving yourself better. And in doing that, I think we'll be growing ourselves and our own sense of self-worth from the inside out in a way that gives us that centered life, that life where we are thriving, that midlife that feels like it's doable for us, instead of like, this is just another thing on my to-do list. If there's any way for you to reframe that, I think that this is the way that you want to focus. And believe me, if you need help with any of this, again, I've said it, but I'm going to say it again, get help. Get help from somebody like me, a mental health professional, a coach, somebody that has some awareness of how to help you shift some of your thinking, some of your behaviors, some of those old habits of yours that are like gasoline on this fire, so that you too can live that centered midlife. I know it's possible for you. And I hope that something in this podcast today resonated so that you can flip this idea of being emotionally stressed at a 40% level and, having your body start to break down on you and financially feeling like you're in a burden during this sandwich time of your life. I want you to know, if you do just any one of these little shifts in the way that you think and show up for yourself, things can get a lot better and a lot easier. So Take that step for yourself, and you too can have a centered midlife. Because I am a licensed clinical psychologist in the state of Minnesota, I have to make sure at the end of each of these episodes that I give you the disclaimer that none of the material that I talk about in these podcasts is meant to replace any kind of therapy or formal medical or mental health treatment. And in fact, anything that I offer on my website, my coaching programs, any kind of psychoeducational materials that I release are not a replacement for that level of care. So just take that into account when you listen. This is information for you, and hopefully you find it of value, both as an educational tool and for your entertainment. And I also want to mention that if anyone you know is in a mental health crisis, needs additional help, I always include these two crisis resources. They're available to anybody. Pick up the phone and dial 988 for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And you can always visit their website at suicidepreventionlifeline.org. Additionally, there's actually a crisis text line. So if you're not somebody that likes to pick up the phone, text HOME, home, to 741-741 to the crisis text line. And you can find them online at crisistextline.org. Thank you for listening to my podcast, and I hope that you like and follow me wherever you get your podcasts, and maybe consider leaving me a review. It always helps me to keep this podcast relevant when I know what you want to hear about.